The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was attacked. It fell because it stopped hearing the truth. Reports said the economy was growing, but it wasn't. Generals said the army was ready. It wasn't. Officials said the harvests were a record. They were a disaster. By the time Moscow figured out what was really happening, the country was already gone. Now, look at China, because the same pattern is repeating. We've watched it unfold in slow motion for 3 years. The warning signs are everywhere. In the data that Beijing publishes, in the data that Beijing refuses to publish, and in the people who used to be standing next to Xi Jinping and aren't standing anywhere anymore. This is not the story of a collapse. Not yet. This is the story of the moment before a collapse. The moment that a great power stops being able to see itself clearly, and by that moment, as the Soviets learned the hard way, is the one that matters more than any other. Let's break down what's actually happening. From the outside, China looks unstoppable. The numbers are enormous. The National Bureau of Statistics reported a gross domestic product of roughly 140 trillion yuan for 2025, about 19.6 trillion US dollars. That makes China, on paper, the second largest economy on Earth, and the largest by purchasing power. The official growth rate came in right on target at 5.0%. Industrial robotics output grew 28%. Electric vehicle production jumped another 25%. Exports hit a record trade surplus of roughly $1.2 trillion. China now builds more ships than the rest of the world combined. It has the largest navy on the planet by hull count. It operates the biggest high-speed rail network, the biggest solar manufacturing base, the biggest battery industry. It launches more satellites in a year than the United States. It produces the overwhelming majority of the world's electric vehicles and controls the supply chains for the minerals that go into them. It runs the world's second biggest military budget. Its leader, Xi Jinping, sits atop a party structure that has not faced a meaningful internal challenge in a generation. Every speech in Beijing ends with the same message. The East is rising, the West is fading, China's century has arrived. And on the surface, there's a case to be made. But here's the thing about surfaces. They're designed to be seen. They're built to be photographed. They exist to be measured by outsiders who don't get to walk around inside and check the wiring. The Soviet Union had a surface too. In 1975, if you stood in Red Square and watched a military parade, you were looking at what foreign analysts genuinely believed was the second most powerful country in the world. Tanks by the 1,000, missiles by the 100, a workforce of 150 million. A space program that had beaten the Americans to the first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first woman in orbit. Nothing about it looked broken. But that was the whole problem, because inside the machine, something had already gone wrong. The Soviet economy ran on a system called Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Gosplan decided how much steel each factory would produce, how much wheat each collective farm would grow, how many tractors each region would build. Those targets were handed down from Moscow, and every level of the system, factory manager, regional boss, ministry official, was evaluated on whether the numbers they reported hit the numbers they'd been told to hit. Now, you can see the problem immediately. If your career depends on reporting success, you report success. If the steel quota is 10 million tons and you produced 8, you still write down 10 and then just hope that nobody checks. If the harvest is short, you borrow grain from next year and put it on this year's books. If a worker dies on the line, the report says the line's running smoothly. Every number going up the chain was a quiet negotiation between what had actually happened and what the next guy up the ladder needed to hear. This worked for a while. Growth in the 1950s and early 60s was real. The USSR electrified, industrialized, built cities from scratch. Khrushchev stood at the United Nations and told the Americans that their grandchildren would live under communism. And plenty of Western economists genuinely believed him. But then, the lies started compounding. By the 1970s, under Brezhnev, the Soviet economy had entered what historians now call the zastoy, the stagnation. Growth slowed, productivity cratered. The oil fields of Western Siberia masked the rot for a decade by pouring hard currency into the treasury. But the underlying system was sick. Factories produced things that nobody wanted because the plan said to produce them. Warehouses filled with unsellable goods. Shortages hit supermarkets in Moscow while grain rotted in silos in Kazakhstan. And nobody at the top could see any of it. The numbers coming up the chain were fiction. Beautiful and consistent, even on target. Weekly, quarterly, Annually. It was all fiction. And then came 1986. On April 26th of that year, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in northern Ukraine exploded during a botched safety test. It was the worst nuclear accident in human history. A radioactive plume rose into the atmosphere and began drifting west across Europe. The local plant managers reported the incident up the chain. The report that they wrote did not say that the core had exploded. It did not say that the graphite was on fire. It did not say the reactor building had been blown open to the sky. The report said there was a situation at the plant. It said radiation levels were elevated, but under control. It said the reactor was intact. None of that was true. The report went to Kiev. Kiev added its own optimistic language. The report went to Moscow. By the time it reached the Politburo, the language had been softened again. The first public acknowledgement from the Soviet government came nearly 3 days later, and only because Swedish monitors more than 1,000 kilometers away detected the radioactive cloud and demanded to know what had happened. Mikhail Gorbachev later said that Chernobyl did more to end the Soviet Union than anything else. Not because of the radiation, but because of what it revealed about the system. The most dangerous facility in the country had just exploded, and the man running the country couldn't get a straight answer about it from his own people for 3 days. He ordered an audit of the rest of the economy. What he found horrified him. The grain harvest numbers were inflated. The industrial output numbers were inflated. The military readiness numbers were inflated. When Western analysts finally got a look at the actual Soviet defense budget after the collapse, they discovered that real military spending had been running at more than double what Moscow itself had been admitting to, and in some estimates, closer to 3 times. The Politburo had been funding its own military on paper money, while the real economy underneath had been hollowing out to pay for it. Nobody at the top of the Soviet Union actually knew what the Soviet Union looked like, not even the men who were supposedly running it. Now, there's a line from that era that cuts deeper than any statistic. The system didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it stopped understanding itself. Every instrument on the dashboard was lying. Every gauge was pegged to green, and the car was already off the road. 5 years later, the country was gone. Now, here's the part that most people get wrong about the Soviet collapse. It wasn't fast. The USSR didn't wake up one morning and shatter. The drift had been going on for 20 years before the ending. What Chernobyl did was force Gorbachev to see it. Glasnost, literally openness, was not a political choice. It was a panicked attempt to reconnect the government to reality after decades of filtered reports. He had asked his own citizens what was going on because he couldn't trust his own officials to tell him. That's what happens at the late stage of a system that stopped hearing the truth. The leader becomes a prisoner of the story everyone around him needs to keep telling. The further up the ladder the information travels, the more polished it gets. By the time it reaches the top, it's been sanded down to the shape of whatever the leader is known to want to hear. And the scariest part is that nobody is lying on purpose. Not most of them. Each person in the chain is just shading a number, softening a memo, burying an inconvenient footnote. Each individual lie is small, but the aggregate is a country governed by fiction. This is the pattern. It's not a Soviet pattern. It's the pattern of any centralized system where honesty costs more than loyalty. And it happened before the USSR, and it'll happen again. And once you see the shape of it, the filtered reports, the punished messengers, the leader slowly sealed inside a bubble of his own advisors, you start to notice it in other places. And there's one place right now where the shape fits perfectly. In 2010, a set of diplomatic cables released through WikiLeaks contained a conversation from 2007 between the American ambassador in Beijing and a Chinese provincial party boss named Li Keqiang. Li was, at that moment, running Liaoning province. 3 years later, he would become the premier of China, the number 2 man in the entire country, the official in charge of the national economy. In that 2007 conversation, Li told the American ambassador something that would have ended his career in China if he had said it out loud. He said that China's official GDP numbers were, in his own words, man-made. He said he didn't trust them. He said that when he wanted to understand what the Chinese economy was actually doing, he looked at 3 things: electricity consumption, rail freight volume, and new bank loans. Everything else, he said, was for reference only. The future premier of China did not trust the numbers that China's own government published about its own economy. Nearly 2 decades later, not much has changed, except that the numbers have gotten harder to check from the outside. Provincial GDP totals in China have historically added up to more than the national GDP. In 2014, the gap between the sum of the provinces and the official national figure was roughly 4.8 trillion yuan. Local officials in northeastern China were reported by state media to have inflated their own economic numbers by as much as 127%. In 2023, when youth unemployment reached 21.3%, the National Bureau of Statistics simply stopped publishing the series. Months later, it returned, several percentage points lower, after students had been quietly excluded from the calculation. And in May of 2023, Beijing cut foreign analysts off from Wind Information, the financial data platform that independent economists had been using to reconstruct what was actually happening inside the Chinese economy. The country that once claimed transparency as a virtue, it's now closing the shutters one window at a time. And the numbers that we can still see tell a story that Beijing very much does not want told. But before we get to that story, the one that reframes everything, if this kind of analysis is what you want more of, hit subscribe. Fall of Nations runs on the viewers who stick around for the parts that other channels skip. Because what comes next is the moment that this pattern stopped being a theory and became a scandal. And the theory goes like this. When a system punishes truth-tellers, people stop telling the truth. And eventually, the leader himself is making trillion-dollar decisions based on reports that bear no relationship to reality. Here's what that looked like in practice. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Xi Jinping reportedly ordered a quiet audit of the People's Liberation Army. He was not impressed by Russia's performance, and he wanted to know whether China's own military, the one that had spent a decade and hundreds of billions of dollars rebuilding, was actually ready to do what the report said it could do. The auditors started with the PLA rocket force, the elite missile branch designed to deter the United States and, if necessary, strike Taiwan. What they allegedly found was almost hard to believe. According to multiple Western defense outlets citing Chinese sources, the auditors discovered missile fuel tanks filled with water instead of rocket propellant. They discovered missile silo lids that wouldn't open because nobody had maintained the hydraulics. They discovered training records signed off for exercises that had never actually taken place. They discovered that promotions inside the rocket force had effectively been for sale, and that the CIA had reportedly been paying the promotion fees of its Chinese agents from around 2007 to 2012, literally buying them careers inside China's most sensitive military command. The branch of the Chinese armed forces designed to hold American carriers at bay was, in parts, a Potemkin village with a price list. Now, Xi was, by all accounts, he had believed his mid-2010s anti-corruption campaign had cleaned the PLA, but it hadn't. And what followed was the largest military purge in Chinese history. Since 2022, over 100 senior PLA officers have been removed or simply vanished from public view. Former Defense Minister Li Shangfu was gone. Former Rocket Force commanders Li Yushao and Zhao Yangning were gone. CMC Vice Chairman He Weidong was gone. And on January 24th of 2026, the hammer came down on the biggest name of all, General Zhang Yusha, the most senior uniformed officer in the entire Chinese military, a childhood friend of Xi Jinping and a fellow princeling. He was placed under investigation for serious violations of discipline and law. Of the 6 generals who sat on the Central Military Commission in 2022, only 1 remains today. Of the 35 3-star generals that Xi himself promoted from 2020 onwards, roughly 32 have since been investigated. Xi Jinping has been told for a decade that his army was the second most powerful on Earth. He had been told wrong. And here's where it gets worse, because Xi's response to discovering the lies has been to purge everyone near the lies. These are his people, his handpicked loyalists, and he can't trust them either. So what do you think the remaining officers are doing right now? They're lying harder, because in a system where the last guy who told the truth was dragged off in an anti-corruption investigation, the only survival strategy is to tell Xi what he wants to hear, louder than the guy next to you, and pray that you're not the next name on the list. The feedback loop has become self-reinforcing. Every purge makes the next report more dishonest. Every dishonest report brings the next purge closer. This is precisely the phase that Moscow entered in the late 1970s. It's the phase where the system starts eating itself. Now apply it to the economy. China's total non-financial debt right now sits at roughly 290% of GDP. That's one of the highest levels in the world. The International Monetary Fund estimates that hidden local government debt, channeled through opaque entities called LGFVs, is somewhere around $9 trillion US, with some independent compilations putting the figure above 12 trillion. Now, Beijing's current plan for dealing with all of this has been described by the Atlantic Council as a program of extend and pretend. And then there's the detail that gives the whole game away. China has now recorded 10 consecutive quarters of deflation. No economy in recorded history has ever grown at 5% a year while prices fall for 10 straight quarters. The math simply does not exist. One of those two numbers is not real. The independent Rhodium Group, which compiles its own estimates of Chinese growth, believes actual 2025 GDP growth was below 3%, not the 5% that Beijing reported. Rhodium also believes that 2022 growth was negative, in a year that Beijing claimed 3% expansion. Guess which set of numbers is closer to what Xi Jinping is being shown? There is, however, one set of numbers that Beijing cannot fake, because it's impossible to hide a baby that was never born. In 2025, Chinese women gave birth to 7.92 million children. That's the lowest number that the country has recorded since 1949, the year that the People's Republic was founded. It's a 17% drop from the year before. To put that number in perspective, demographers at the American Enterprise Institute have calculated that China's 2025 birth level is comparable to where the country was in roughly 1738, when the total Chinese population was about 150 million. Today's population is more than 9 times that. This is not a slowdown. It's a generational vanishing act. China's population fell by another 3.4 million people in 2025. That's the 4th consecutive year of decline. The total fertility rate now sits at roughly 1.0, less than half of what it takes to replace the existing population. There are now 323 million Chinese over the age of 60, about 23% of the entire country. The cohort of women in prime childbearing age is projected to collapse from around 105 million today to about 58 million by 2050. Xi Jinping has tried everything. He ended the one-child policy. He introduced a nationwide 3,600 yuan annual childcare subsidy. He directed local family planning committees, the same ones that once enforced the one-child policy, to start calling women and checking on their menstrual cycles. He removed the value-added tax exemption on contraceptives, which means that as of January 2025, condoms in China now carry a 13% tax. Beijing is, in a sentence that would sound absurd anywhere else, is literally taxing condoms to try to grow the population. But none of it is working. A 2025 Rand Corporation analysis concluded that China's pro-natalist policies are not reversing the fertility decline. One of China's own senior demographers, speaking to state media, put it more plainly. A return to positive population growth, he said, is almost off the table. Now, these are the numbers that you can't filter on your way up the chain. They're the ground truth, and they say the system is running out of time. So what does all of this mean? It means that the story that the world has been told for 20 years, the story of an unstoppable rising China running clean past a decaying West, may be a version of the same story that the world was told about the Soviet Union in 1975. Enormous, ordered, efficient, terrifying, and hollow in ways that almost nobody inside the system was allowed to say out loud. It doesn't mean that China is going to collapse next week. This is the part that gets misunderstood. Great powers, they don't often fall in a flash, but rather they drift. They spend years looking exactly the way that they're supposed to look, while the distance between the map and the territory silently widens. The Soviets drifted for 20 years before the end, and the end, when it came, still caught almost everyone by surprise, including the man sitting in the Kremlin. Now, what the pattern tells us is this. China's most dangerous problem is not its debt. It's not its demographics. It's not even its military. It's that the man running China is increasingly surrounded by people whose careers depend on telling him things that may not be true. Every purge tightens the bubble. Every report through the new loyalist chain is a little more curated than the last one. And the decisions that Xi Jinping is making right now about the property sector, about Taiwan, about the next 5-year plan, are being made on the basis of that curated information. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because its leadership could not see what weakness looked like from the inside. By the time the view cleared, there was nothing left to save. Nothing about China's path is guaranteed. Beijing could still course correct. Xi could still choose to hear bad news instead of purging it. The data could start flowing again. Stranger things have happened. But the pattern is the pattern. And that pattern has a direction. Great powers don't fall the moment that something breaks. They fall when they stop being able to see what's broken at all. So here's a question that we'd like to leave you with. If the man at the top of China is now getting the same kind of reports that the man at the top of the Soviet Union used to get, is China still the rising power that the world keeps telling itself that it is? Or is it 1985 all over again, and nobody wants to say it? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more of the stories that the headlines aren't telling you.